Most stories of World War I submarines speak of weapons and battles, of ships lost and numbers counted. But this story begins smaller. A diary, kept by an engineer aboard the German submarine UC-71. His words, scribbled between patrols, survive where official reports fall silent. Lines about the sharp smell of oil in his clothes, the stillness before charges shook the water, the taste of air when the hatch first closed. Inside those pages lies not strategy, but sensation, not victory, but memory, and it begins with his very first sight of the sea. What does a recruit notice first? The ocean's openness or its silence? For Richard Stumpf, the earliest words in his diary capture that moment with a curious lightness. A tinsmith from Bavaria conscripted into the Kaiser's navy, he stepped aboard the battleship SMS Helgoland in 1912, just before the war broke out. His notebooks, later spanning 6 volumes, recorded how the sea air struck him as cleaner than anything he had ever known on land. Freer of smoke from cities, freer of factory dust. Ahead of him stretched only water and horizon, an unbroken line that seemed to promise possibility. He stood on the upper deck, uniform stiff with newness, still untouched by salt or sweat. Gulls wheeled and called behind the ship, following as though the journey itself carried omens. For a brief time he let himself feel lucky, even curious, before the war reshaped that view. In those early pages, the diary reads less like a document of war and more like the notes of an attentive traveller. He wrote about the ship's slow sway beneath his boots and the way companions leaned against the rail to find balance. Orders came sharp from officers, clipped German carried across steel surfaces and mixed with the pounding of waves against the hull. He noticed others nearby, faces that betrayed eagerness, nervousness, even sickness. Some gripped the railing tight, while others stared outward, as though trying to take in every inch of the horizon. Stumpf added details no official report would ever bother to preserve. Scraps tossed overboard and snatched at by gulls, spray on men's jackets, the surface of the sea quiet one moment and restless the next. Reading those lines, it feels as if he were less a sailor in training for battle than a witness sketching scenes of an unfamiliar world. Let's pause here. These first impressions carry a softness that would vanish in the months that followed. Stumpf placed the sea in almost poetic terms, as though it were offering him lessons. The atmosphere still felt open, expansive, even forgiving. But lurking within those pages is a contrast already beginning to form. Because Helgoland, like all ships of the high seas fleet, was not an open stage, but a floating machine meant for discipline and confinement. Stumpf may not have emitted fear, yet it seeps through his admiration for waves and light. He gazed outward, toward the expanse, without yet describing what it meant to live within iron walls, beneath officers' constant watch. During those first days, his senses absorbed mostly freedom. The deck still smelled alive, carrying clean salt wind rather than sweat, oil, and stale air that defined life deep inside the ship. He described his bread and coffee breakfast, eaten in the open, gulls shrieking overhead. His hands were still marked faintly by chalk from the training grounds, a reminder of lessons on shore. His boots looked new, unworn leather, unscuffed by seawater, uncreased by weeks of standing in readiness. All of this he put into notes touched with energy, a record of his anticipation before endurance settled in. For us as readers, these details matter more than statistics. Naval archives record tonnage, victories, defeats. They do not record the smell of diesel shifting in wind or the sound of boots across planks. Stumpf's diary restored that layer of life otherwise lost. It is why the Reichstag decades later consulted his notebooks during their inquiry into the war. They represented the unspoken, a record from an ordinary sailor who wrote down what officers ignored. What he noticed most, and what he would have to give up, was simply open air. You can almost imagine standing beside him on that first watch. The steady churn of engines underfoot, each vibration passing upward through steel. The constant rhythm of boots stepping against ordered commands. Hard consonants bounced over metal, softened when men murmured to each other away from officers' ears. The wind sliced across cheeks, water mirrored sunlight and turned suddenly rough with a change in breeze. In those first hours, there was little fear and more curiosity. The diary reveals that he believed for just a time that the sea welcomed him. Yet already, between those words, optimism balances on a thread. Later in his notebooks, Stumpf wrote in the margin, recalling this first view as clean air. By then, below deck's air had grown heavy with heat, exhaust, damp clothing, unwashed bodies. That one phrase, clean air, wasn't only about the breeze itself, it was about everything it represented. Breathing freely, space without limit, moments free of orders. He compared the first day aboard Helgoland to stepping into a quiet countryside after weeks stuck inside barracks. In memory, it shone brighter, clearer. He carried that scene as a private symbol, revisiting it again when the ship felt suffocating. This is why the first description matters. The sea was not yet a foe, but a sweep of space. His writing, careful in its strokes, shaped letters with confidence, as though order still held in the world. In retrospect, those earliest pages ring with irony. Freedom recorded in detail by a sailor who would soon spend years on a battleship where liberty was scarce. The notebooks allow us to see him convincing himself, as much as describing to others, that something like freedom might still exist beyond the horizon. And the quiet power of the scene lies in how he cherished what would later feel like a luxury. The breeze, the gulls, even sunlight breaking across water. He held them in words, written plainly, but with weight. They were, perhaps without his full awareness, the last breaths untainted by the routines and restrictions of wartime naval life. Each sentence preserved the memory of air itself, before naval service closed down choices and confined him inside. Those moments on deck also foreshadow what came next. Stumpf's view stretched outward, at first, measuring life in miles, spaces, and endless surface. Soon, however, each detail in the diary would shrink. He would measure his world not by horizon but by walls. He would hear not gulls but creaking steel, engines pressing through nights, men breathing close at his side. He would notice smells shift from salt air to burned oil, from open wind to exhaust trapped within bulkheads. To understand what came later in his account, we must hold on to his first glimpse of the sea, because the shock of transition only matters when we remember the freedom that came before. And it is at this threshold where freedom met steel that his diary turns. Crossing that first hatch meant leaving behind sunlight and air and stepping into a world that would define his service. The diaries of submarine crews describe that threshold in unshakable terms, the instant when one boot touched the iron rim and the descent began. Unlike Richard Stumpf's battleship notebooks, which told of open decks and officer-sailor tensions on the SMS Helgoland, here the words come from men who served in cramped U-boats, and lived with the sea pressing in at every side. Their writing shows how daylight narrowed into dim corridors, and how freedom was exchanged for confinement the moment the hatch closed above their heads. The downward climb was short but unforgettable. Narrow ladders forced men to stoop forward, shoulders brushing pipes wrapped in sweating condensation. The air was damp even before the vessel slipped beneath the waves. Each diary that survives offers similar details: a metallic taste in the mouth, a smell more complex than anything on shore, oil and diesel mixed with the sour damp of clothing that never quite dried. One sailor compared it to the air in a smithy, heat and acrid smoke without pause. Another wrote of feeling the humidity rise with every rung below, until his breathing slowed in protest. That shift in sensation told him instantly this was not the deck of a warship, but the hidden chamber of a boat built for stealth. Bunks appeared first on either side of the passage. They were stacked in threes, jammed against the hull so tight that climbing in meant crawling across another body. Hot bunking was the norm. When one man rose for duty, another slid into his still warm bedding. The mattresses were thin and salt dampness stained covers in a way that never left them. A hand run along the wall came away wet, a film of condensation smearing cloth. Tools, wrenches and spare parts were fixed overhead, hanging like ribs from a skeleton, reminders that nothing aboard could be wasted on comfort. You can picture the pause on that first descent. One hand clutched the ladder, a quick glance over the shoulder for the last square of daylight, and then the clang of the hatch above closing tight. The bolts turned, echoing through iron and through the chest of whoever stood beneath. From that moment, the men belonged to the submarine, bound by steel. Years later, some remembered the silence that followed, how no one spoke for a long while, as if their voices might test the walls that now enclosed them. Echoes gave even whispers an odd sharpness. Laughter faded too quickly, swallowed by bulkheads. One of the first truths learned was that life here demanded quiet, not enforced by discipline, but by the acoustics of iron. A diary excerpt placed here can bring that experience close. Read softly, with a low hum of engines beneath. The walls press, though no hand touches them. I breathe, yet the air already feels borrowed. Such words captured the sensation of space shrinking with every hour. The phrases were spare, but their weight carried further than any description of machines or drills. The unease grew alongside familiarity. His notes described the constant throb of pumps, the tapping of pipes as water shifted, the rattle of valves. None of it ever stopped. Even when the crew slept, there was a vibration under the skin that kept reminding them the vessel was alive. Imagine hoping for silence and instead finding the steady song of machinery filling every corner. To the men, it felt like stepping into the body of a creature not entirely under their control. For them, this was not poetry. It was survival to pay attention to every change in sound or temperature. Sketches in margins tried to capture what words could not. Ladders so steep that gear had to be passed hand to hand. Passageways so narrow shoulders scraped with each turn. Tables no bigger than ration tins doubled as desks and mess. Stains from endless meals layered one on top of another. To the outside world, a submarine was a weapon. To those inside, it was closer to a moving factory, every inch built to strike, and none to ease the men who ran it. One short vignette tells the story better than diagrams. Lamps burned with a faint yellow, clouding the air more than lighting it. Faces took on a pale tone, and in that light eyes sometimes caught a glimmer like animals startled in the dark. Further down came smells in layers that could not be avoided. Oil melted into uniforms, rations heating in cramped galley corners, boots that never stayed dry. A knock of spanner on valve, a hiss of compressed air, the hush of water pressing at the hull, all blended into one orchestra that played without pause. Each sound marked the space as much as each smell. In later reflections, men called their vessels iron coffins. The phrase was less about death itself than about the sensation of burial before the end arrived. In the earliest notes, there was still a trace of pride. Serving aboard meant skill and daring, but between the lines, the truth stood clear. The air grew stale too fast. Space vanished into walls. Doors stayed locked, and windows did not exist. Whatever heroism recruits expected dissolved into daily endurance. Crossing the hatch for the first time set the tone for everything after. It was not marked by stirring speeches or promises of glory, but by loss of air, of space, of light. Each return to the diary circled back to that truth. The hatch was more than steel. It was the line between freedom and duty, an ever-present reminder that once below, a man ceased to belong to himself until the boat surfaced. This first crossing rearranged the senses. Days above the sea had been measured in sky and horizon. Inside, the world shrank to inches of bunk and metal vibrating underfoot. The boundary was complete and irreversible. From then forward, each detail of life aboard would be filtered through a body and mind forced to adapt. The diary made that shift visible, not through grand events, but through sensations etched in quiet words. And what stayed with him most was not the moment his boots reached the floor, but what followed, the realization that silence no longer existed. Once the hatch had closed, sound became constant, shaping every hour. And it is with those sounds that his account continues. Imagine lying still and hearing steel shift like a voice from the deep. That was how crewmen described their nights on patrol. When lamps dimmed and bunks filled, the submarine itself seemed to breathe with them. Water pressure called up long creaks and sighs that moved from bow to stern. Sometimes it came as a low moan, other times as a sudden snap that struck the nerves like a warning. Above them stretched the ocean, calm or rough depending on the weather, but inside it translated as constant strain. The steel never truly rested. The engines joined this chorus without pause. At full running speed, their vibration filled every compartment, masking thought as well as speech. When throttled back, they lowered to a steady hum, but even then they claimed the background. Mixed with the rush of water past the hull, the sound pressed into men's dreams. A single loose nail rattling could take shape inside the mind as something larger, shaking the thin layer of rest from a cramped bunk. Several diaries suggest the machinery spoke in coded messages, as if the submarine tried to say what men could not translate. Noise, blurred certainty. A groan from the plates might be nothing, or it might mean pressure biting at a seam. The water's rush told of steady motion, but it could also hide the beat of propellers chasing them. Every sound carried two meanings, ordinary and threatening, and men had to live inside both at once. In the notebooks, this ambiguity filled entire passages. He was never sure whether to be reassured or alarmed. Sound became an endless reminder that the line between stability and collapse was thinner than the steel around them. In those confined conditions, voices dropped. No written order demanded whispers, yet old accounts agree. The conversation shrank to murmurs. Sailors trained themselves to imagine that speech might leak through pipes and reach the sea. They knew the science was weak, but instinct proved stronger. Jokes softened to low chuckles. A single cough in darkness could make neighbours twitch awake. The boat's acoustic world ruled their behaviour more rigidly than officers could. Whispering was less choice than reflex. Oral testimonies and later studies of men who lived in such spaces show clear effects. Repetitive sounds fix the body in a state of strain. The heart keeps a quicker rhythm. Hands stay tense, sleep lightens or disappears. Insomnia becomes a constant because silence never arrives. One diary paints the image of an internal clock, wound too tight, every second, measured in pulsing machinery. He compared it to lying next to a clock with a pendulum that never paused, not soothing but punishing, a reminder that time was not his own. His body wanted quiet, but the boat allowed none. During the early days, he wrote with a kind of fascination. Steel and water seemed almost musical to him, a rhythm the sea played against iron. He counted beats, traced patterns, listened analytically like a craftsman studying new tools. Yet the tone shifted over weeks. What once sounded like music turned to repetition that mocked him. The song degraded to monotonous echoes, erasing sleep. The submarine no longer felt like a companion, but a cage forcing its chant into his bones. In place of curiosity came weariness. Step inside with ears open and you would notice the layers. Bursts of compressed air hissing from pipes. A hull groan as pressure changed depth. The slide of rubber soles on oily metal. Each sound bounced wider in those confined walls, magnified until small gestures grew outsized. He once described waking unclear whether a noise had entered his dream or whether he had simply never slept at all. That confusion drained the crew slowly, straining their tempers so that even a trivial clank could feel like an insult aimed directly at them. When the submarine slowed to near stillness, they longed for release, yet still the interior spoke. Water pressed, metal clicked faintly, droplets fell into trays with monotonous rhythm. These small details filled the space more completely than Layage engines did. The speaker paused to note how silence in their world did not exist. Hearing became survival. Each signal weighed for threat. He once admitted wishing for louder sounds, men shouting, commands ringing, because at least such noise carried certainty. The quiet intervals carved into them as something harsher than any drill. Let's pause here. On land, silence might stand for rest or safety. In these notebooks, silence was a myth. What existed instead was the constant presence of steel and sea, touching the ear every moment, tightening the nerves, eroding sleep. The sounds themselves were not battles, yet they became battles of endurance. The diaries show not so much complaint as observation, that these intrusions form life structure below. Other submariners have recorded the same, days marked not by enemy ships, but by the iron chorus around them. That is the realization. True silence lived elsewhere, never below water. Even when all men hushed, the vessel and ocean carried on, their dialogue reverberating through iron. What it meant was unceasing vigilance, a body trained into alertness and never allowed to ease. Men carried that pressure in posture, in glances, in lightless nights of half sleep. The effect was exhaustion without relief. Morale worn not by combat alone, but by the endless background that never ended. These noises did not feel like machinery. They felt like verdicts, shaping how men slept, joked, or feared. And so, once ears grew heavy with fatigue, survival depended on something else to break the monotony. Because when every sound pressed, men needed another rhythm to hold on to, one that belonged to them. It is here that his notes turn to the routines carved from daily life, the smallest acts that lifted their burden for brief moments. Meals and the small rituals that surrounded them became the clearest counterweight to life inside steel. Sailors' diaries, from Stumpf's notebooks to the accounts held by the Imperial War Museum, note how bread, coffee, and small gestures brought order to hours that otherwise blurred into one another. Bread was passed down the mess table, not cut into neat portions, but broken by hand, each man taking his share before sending it on. Dark and crusted, sometimes speckled with the mole sailors jokingly called rabbits, it was rarely appetizing. Yet the act of breaking and handing it forward carried weight. Weak coffee followed in dented mugs, more brown water than drink, but those minutes at the table offered rhythm. For a time, the submarine felt less like an iron chamber, and more like a room where men remembered ordinary life. Across the benches, even rank seemed less rigid. Officers sat within arm's reach of enlisted men, divided by custom but united in hunger. Diaries describe an officer laughing when a sailor tried to use a warm bulkhead pipe in place of a missing butter knife. For many crews, these brief meals collapsed the gap between command and duty. Everyone ate the same stale bread, drank the same thin coffee, breathed the same recycled air. That equality softened tension just long enough for humour to appear. Laughter could ripple from something as small as a piece of cheese dropped on the floor. 3 men scrambling to rescue it before damp ruined it. The retelling stretched into hours of mimicry and joke. Such comic fragments, Stumpf noted, became shared stories reused until they felt like part of the boat itself. In that way, mealtime became less about sustenance and more about community. They also provided a way to reckon time. Deprived of daylight, crews needed fixed points to mark where one day ended and another began. Food, even if spoiled or rationed beyond comfort, served as those markers. The IWM collection includes memories of men dreading the taste of fungus-streaked loaves kept too long in storage, yet still grateful to have them because it meant a pause from duty. Eating together required the engine's throb to fade into the background, required tools to be set aside. Even imperfect food became a signal of endurance. For Stumpf, chewing bread while imagining hostile destroyers circling above was a form of defiance, an acknowledgement that life continued under threat. In his diary margins, he admitted that each bite could feel like quiet bravery, eating as if tomorrow still waited. With meals came rituals, almost unconscious but vital. Afterward, voices sometimes rose in faint singing, barely more than a hum, fragmentary verses from festivals or village gatherings remembered from shore. The sound was uneven, men starting and stopping without pattern, but the effect laced the crew together. Alongside song came other small customs, mugs tapped rhythmically, days counted on scraps of paper, pencil marks that proved time was passing. These gestures provided shape when hours otherwise dissolved into noise. Imagine the scratch of a stub of lead on paper, or the worn sound of spoons clinking tin cups, simple, almost invisible actions that, within confinement, steadied thought. What it gave them most was identity. A man who whittled scrap wood or traced patterns on the table with a fingertip reclaimed a piece of himself. In entries describing those gestures, Stumpf's tone shifted. For a short while, individuals could express something beyond uniform and routine. The submarine's pressure shrank, not in size but in sensation. Shoulders pressed together felt less like crowding, more like companionship. After a plain stew one evening, according to his notes, the crew lingered. They spoke of kitchens, courtyards, and scents from home. In that moment, the submarine disappeared, replaced by remembered rooms. Food had the power to transport, not in fantasy, but in memory. Those acts, however small, guarded them from despair. In the margins of history, these notes claim little attention. A slice of bread, a muttered verse, a day marked on paper. Yet for men underwater, they were safeguards. Stumpf would later write that such routines held back madness. He did not mean the word loosely. Madness was the risk of noise without end, of fear without outlet, of days with no before or after. Small rituals formed walls inside his mind, slowing the seep of despair. For historians, this matches what researchers of submarine life have long suggested. Meals and routine carried morale in ways weapons never could. These gestures could not change the dangers outside. Destroyers still patrolled, depth charges still struck, air still grew heavy with oil fumes, but they let men feel human when steel sought to erase them. In that gap lay a fragile kind of family, joined not by choice, but by the need to survive together. They learned endurance not through courage alone, but through the act of passing bread, tapping mugs, humming verses, or sharing a fragment of memory. It was an inheritance they guarded quietly, knowing that without it, the noise and confinement might unmake them. That closeness, drawn out of small rituals, carried strength for a time, yet between the warmth of bread shared in dim light and the next command at the periscope stood a divide. What lingered after meals was humanity. What returned when orders were given was the cold weight of duty. And in his next pages, he wrote of how those two realities collided. Rituals of togetherness faced against the solitary pull of conscience when the order came to fire. Does the act of attack change when the face in the periscope seems to mirror your own? For men who served in U-boats, this became the heaviest private burden. Testimonies preserved in the Imperial War Museum, like those of Franz Becker and other submarine officers, describe the moral unease that followed each launch. Their words, simple and unadorned, show that firing a torpedo did not end with the jolt of machinery. It continued in memory, in sleepless hours, in the conscience of men who carried only fragments of justification. The reflection in the glass was not just tactic, it was reminder. One diary notes the moment just before firing when the order passed down in clip commands. Range, angle, fire. Inside the same second, thoughts travelled elsewhere. The writer admitted his hand shook as he touched the lever. Training told him to obey, yet his mind filled with questions. Who were they striking? Were the men opposite also writing home, laughing at breakfast, hoping for survival? His account does not answer directly. Instead, the page trails off mid-sentence. That silence conveys what words could not. Torpedoes turned abstract orders into concrete destruction. Once the wake streamed outward, there was no retrieving it. Some submariners felt professional pride that launches struck cleanly, yet even those lines of satisfaction were shadowed by unease. One IWM witness recalled the shock of hearing explosions beneath his boots, then imagining the panic on the deck of the merchant ship they had just targeted. The honesty of that reflection sits in contrast to the official reports, which reduced events to tonnage and numbers. For the men who pulled levers, conscience sat closer than statistics. This tension grew sharper in 1917, when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. The policy meant that merchantmen, liners, and often any vessel carrying supplies to Britain could become targets. On paper, it was strategy. On the firing line, it was something different. Submariners wrote of the blurring between civilian and combatant, of sinking ships whose crews wore no uniforms. To officers on shore, these were victories. To men beneath the sea, it brought nights filled with hesitation, and in many notebooks, the absence of final words. Pages turned blank when reflection crossed into guilt too heavy to spell out. Inside the hull, routine never paused. Torpedo crews loaded tubes, gauges clicked, oil lamps cast light across sweating metal. Each man knew his part. Work replaced thought, and for many that was survival. Yet those who kept diaries admitted that even as their hands moved with drilled precision, the mind wavered elsewhere. One wrote, "It is not the ship I fire at, but the people unseen within." He left no comment after that line. Years later, reading those words aloud still carries the sting of their unfinished weight. You can almost imagine the stillness. Lamps low, bodies pressed close, engines at half speed. The commander aligning sight through periscope glass. Silence around him did not mean agreement. It meant each man waited for the impact and carried private thoughts he could never speak aloud. In testimonies preserved later, some admitted they chose not to look, preferring to busy themselves with gauges and valves rather than stare into the periscope. Avoidance became its own form of coping, a way to let duty pass without letting conscience fully catch up. For men like Becker, the contradiction never eased. He described feeling genuine satisfaction in his crew's coordination. It meant they had learned, they had mastered their trade. Yet in the very next passage, he revealed that each success carved into his sleep. Precision, instead of pride alone, became a reminder that guilt was now sharpened too. Stumpf, aboard a battleship rather than a submarine, framed guilt differently. He turned it toward the officer class, their harshness and privilege, their orders that left enlisted men carrying costs they did not choose. In either setting, conscience took root. It filled corners where air and food were already scarce. Let's pause and mark what matters in these accounts. Officers in the reports praised efficiency. Commanders counted tonnage sunk. None of them wrote about hesitation. But diaries reveal how that same hesitation lingered far longer than commendations. For one sailor, the sound of the explosion was not memory of victory, but a rhythm that returned in dreams. For another, the reflection in the periscope became inescapable, a face overlaid onto the target ship, a fleeting sense he could not dismiss. These passages were not statistics, they were admissions of strain, pages where conscience leaked through iron walls. Even when they tried to describe successes, their tone softened. Instead of triumph, notebooks read like ledgers. A ship scene, a torpedo fired, impact confirmed. What follows is rarely celebration. It is often fragmentary, half entries or sketches that hint at unfinished thought. To historians, those fragments matter. They show restraint where official rhetoric wanted confidence. They show humanity where propaganda wanted hardness. Survivors understood that war needed obedience, but privately, writing gave them space to acknowledge cost. And conscience was not just fleeting, it repeated. Each new patrol brought the same questions, even if the answers never changed. A note scribbled weeks after a launch speaks of unease rising again. We moved on, but I hear the sound still. The act of recording was perhaps the only outlet allowed. Spoken aloud, such admissions might sound like weakness in a space where unity was survival. On paper, inside margins that could be hidden, it became bearable. Through this lens, diaries grow into something greater than individual memory. They expose how broad decisions, like the 1917 policy, press down onto private minds. They show how conscience and duty shared the same compartments, neither erasing the other. And they remind us that history's great strategies were lived in silence by men wrestling with doubt between pumps, gauges, and periscopes. Now imagine this conflict mixing with other strains. In a submarine where bunks were scarce and food was stale, the burden of hesitation about attack crossed with frustrations over privilege and rank. Conscience about the enemy soon combined with bitterness toward leadership at home. As his pages show, the questions raised in silence did not remain isolated. They joined with daily grievances until together they thickened the air. That uneasy blend would press against the walls as much as seawater did, waiting for release. In the cramped quarters of the fleet, the sharpest division did not come from the steel walls, but from the differences between officers and enlisted men. Richard Stumpf's diary makes this clear, describing how even small privileges turned into daily reminders of inequality. Officers received slightly better food, a thicker slice of bread, a stronger pour of coffee, while the men in lower bunks made do with less. In such confined space, the difference was impossible to ignore. A crumb more here, a laugh on the other side of a partition there, and suddenly a ship already bursting with pressure carried an invisible war within it. One page captures his bitterness with vivid precision. He was once ordered to polish officers' boots using oil-stained rags, while depth charges thudded outside the hull of a battleship. Explosions rattled plates loose, yet the task carried on as though danger was secondary to appearance. Stumpf found the order humiliating, less for what it asked than for what it represented. He pointed out in his notebook that the leather dimmed in the weak light anyway, so polish became parody. Not duty, but a reminder of who mattered most and who mattered least. The frustration does not shout from his text. It accumulates quietly, each entry layering upon the last, until irritation hardens into something closer to resolve. Claustrophobia made these divisions more punishing. On open decks it was possible to step away, even if just for a breath of air. Below there was no escape. Stumpf recorded the sound of officers talking and laughing in their mess, voices that reached enlisted men through steel partitions, carried down passageways until they amplified the sense of distance inside a few feet of space. The proximity turned every sound into an unintentional reminder. Some carried maps and commands, others carried buckets, coal dust, or stained rags. Chores defined this hierarchy more than clothing did. Stumpf noted that enlisted men scrubbed condensation and grease from the same decks where they ate and slept, while officers tended to charts and instruments in drier, cleaner compartments. Everyone faced the same shells and torpedoes when combat came, but in the long hours of waiting the divisions stayed sharp. His irritation grew not from dramatic injustice, but from countless small details. Thin coffee poured beside the smell of richer brew behind a door. Food rations given from one pot, while better portions came discreetly from another. Over time, such inequalities pressed heavier than steel bulkheads. Imagine being handed a chipped mug with watery coffee while a stronger pot warmed nearby. For one day it might have been tolerable. For weeks it grew unbearable. The lack of air, rest and light meant every difference bore down with disproportionate weight. Stumpf's words turned slowly colder as the war wore on, his diary shifting from small complaints to open resentment. He began to question why risk and suffering were shared, but recognition was not. A torpedo made no rank distinction, neither did disease nor exhaustion. For Stumpf, endurance could never feel equal when reward and comfort were divided along old class lines. He rarely named politics early in his notes, yet between the details, historians now see the outline of unrest. Later events, mutinies in port cities and aboard ships, sprang not from abstract ideas, but from realities sketched here. Boots polished while hulls shook, unequal food when hunger was common, laughter heard through divisions, while men in lower bunks lay awake in sour air. What official records, later called unreliability among sailors, grew first from these lived experiences. For Stumpf, they became proof that the officer caste sought to prolong a war from which sailors longed for release. Years later, this view mattered enough for him to testify at the Reichstag inquiry, where his words gave voice to how inequality inside the fleet fostered rebellion. Let's pause here to picture what his days looked like. A row of boots lined for inspection, their shine demanded by superiors, while the deck beneath them grew slick with condensation. A man bent low, rag in hand, performing a task he knew would be undone within an hour. Stumpf called the boots silent witnesses, evidence of a system that asked obedience but returned no fairness. These rows became symbols of imbalance, recorded not in theory but in his own pencil strokes. History often paints class conflict in sweeping colours, but here it shows itself through scenes as ordinary as meals and chores. Stumpf's diary strips away generalisation. It records resentment born of hunger, humiliation, and tired bodies doing unequal work while danger pressed equally in from outside. Metal confined their movements, but hierarchy confined their spirit. He endured both, and his notes suggest that resentment grew into a fixed companion, alongside fear and fatigue, until it helped shape the unrest that eventually reached the surface. Even so, bitterness was not total. Fleeting moments softened it. Letters, folded and taken out again and again, offered reminders of another world. Within their lines came voices of wives, children, parents, voices that ignored rank and addressed men simply as family. Stumpf noted how the reading of such letters could turn a confined bunk into a shared space of laughter. For a few minutes, the difference between officer and enlisted mattered less than the reminder of belonging. Those fragile intervals stood out against the harsh patterns he recorded daily. They lent the men something unequal pay, or better rations never could, the chance to feel human again inside steel walls. And it was those fragile papers, not polished boots, that kept minds steady long enough to bear the waiting. In the next part of his story, the focus turns to what those envelopes carried, and why they meant more than rations or orders ever could. In those long sealed days, nothing stirred the crew more than the faint promise of an envelope. Messages from home carried a weight larger than rations, and thicker than the steel around them. Stumpf wrote of the way letters reached into the monotony of shipboard life, breaking through the endless rhythm of watches, engines, and damp air. Each fragile sheet reminded men that somewhere beyond the hull there were trees shifting in the wind, voices at markets and kitchens where bread baked without the sourness of salt or oil. For him, these papers were anchors to another self, not only a sailor, but still a son, still a German artisan drafted from ordinary life. The anticipation could gnaw harder than hunger. Letters did not arrive steadily. They came whenever the ship touched port or passed a courier. In the days before, anticipation spread like fever. Men whispered about them during meals, speculating whether their children had written, whether censors allowed words past, whether envelopes had gone missing. When at last a bundle appeared, they crowded the narrow compartments until shoulders brushed, trying to glimpse what lay in those folded rectangles. Stumpf recalled faces pale from weeks underwater, suddenly lit with brightness, eyes sharpened, bodies pressed close, men waiting, as though a hand might draw luck from the stack itself. Yet letters never arrived untouched. Thick black strokes of censor's ink scarred the pages. Sometimes entire sentences vanished, an empty space where a name should have been suggested more than the words that survived. One page ending abruptly could trigger days of speculation. In his diary, Stumpf admitted that censor's gaps created more anguish than reassurance. Letters soothed, but they could just as easily wound. What remained hidden felt heavier than what came through. Still, even fragments offered proof that someone waited above. Men clung to scraps of news, worrying less about completeness than about the presence of connection itself. It was not unusual for a single letter to become communal. One sailor would sit by a bunk reading aloud what his wife had written, while others leaned close. Descriptions of a child's mischief or a mother's prayers evoked laughter that echoed differently from the usual machinery. Voices softened when news carried sorrow, yet even then it helped to share. A letter written to one man became a possession of many, lifting the whole compartment for an evening. Stumpf described the hush that followed. An atmosphere changed for a brief time, as if the submarine's oppressive walls receded. He treated his own letters as if they were treasures, folded again and again, slipping into his jacket pocket. They wore thin along the creases. The ink blurred from oil and touch, the paper softened like cloth. Still, he returned to them in odd hours, reading sentences he already knew by heart. One companion read aloud his wife's words 3 times in a single day, each repetition less a reminder than a ritual. The sound of the familiar voice that steadied him against exhaustion. The paper frayed, but the words gave strength, renewed. Modern researchers would later confirm what these sailors instinctively knew. Correspondence countered despair. Soldiers without letters suffered higher isolation. Their morale eroded one missing envelope at a time. Stumpf never articulated this in analytic terms, but his writing shows evidence of it. He acknowledged that these words pulled men back toward their personal names, their families, their ties. Though diaries were private, they shared the same purpose. Stumpf himself confessed that he wrote to remember his war memories, to hold on to identity beyond immediate order. Letters and diary together preserved the fragile picture of self inside a machine built for anonymity. The scarcity elevated letters beyond measure. Cigarettes could burn out, bread could mould, but paper carried even when ragged. Men hid them in tins, tucked them under mattresses, or pressed them against their chests until the warmth made them nearly translucent. Envelopes showed grease marks, salt stains, even smudged handwriting, but not one was discarded. They became the most valuable objects aboard, prized more than spare rations. To lose a letter felt like losing a voice, irreplaceable until landfall might bring another bundle. Around them formed subtle rituals. After each distribution, silence spread as men retreated into corners, lips moving in muted whispers as they read. Later, fragments were exchanged. Talk of a harvest completed, a neighbour who repaired the roof, a child learning his first letters. These scattered images stitched together to remind them of a broader world still moving above the sea. You can almost hear the overlapping murmur of stories weaving through the compartments, fields, kitchens, markets, all carried into the chamber through paper and ink. Stumpf noted how time altered inside these readings. Watches still turned, orders still came, but letters made moments feel suspended. He stretched each line deliberately, rereading short phrases to extend the connection. Other men did the same, dragging out the scarce comfort for as long as breath lasted. For those minutes, the iron chorus of machinery shrank. It felt, as he wrote, like catching air untouched by fumes. Censorship complicated, but did not diminish the ritual. Lines removed forced men to imagine, sometimes painfully, but simple words often carried enough to sustain them. Safe, waiting, soon, each of these could shift entire moods. If one man learned his newborn had survived a fever, relief spread across the mess. If another heard of a family harvest, laughter returned for a night. The smallest reports from home became lifelines, stronger than any formal speech or nationalist call. The letters lived on long after their first opening. Men slid them under pillows, pressed them into breast pockets, or traced the shapes with their fingers until ink blurred. Some said they could still detect the scent of the home they had left long before, even beneath oil and diesel. Stumpf captured it in a single note. The pages smelled of the air above. Whether true or imagined, it gave meaning deeper than pragmatism. Picture the submarine trembling under distant detonations, lamps flickering, dust drifting down from pipes. Yet one man leans against steel, unfolding a letter as though nothing outside could touch that moment. For him, for many of them, paper outweighed explosions. These letters were not abstractions. They were survival made tangible. They provided purpose, not measured by orders or tonnage, but by faces written into ink. In the margins of history, these scraps appear secondary. But for the men sealed inside, they were decisive. They carried the knowledge that somewhere beyond the sea, life awaited them. Letters gave men reason to endure. Less rhetoric than faces, less command than memory. They steadied conscience and stitched companionship, drawing men back toward themselves through the tightest hours beneath the surface. But words could not shield them entirely. Letters softened watchfulness for an evening, yet the sea remained merciless. Danger could break through without warning, and comfort quickly yielded to survival. In the pages that follow, Stumpf's quiet reflections on home sit beside entries where explosions tore through the night, moments that pressed every nerve to the limit and reminded them how thin the line between life and death could be. Depth charges became the supreme test of endurance. Stumpf's writings and the testimonies of others who served below the surface depict these moments not as battles fought, but as ordeals survived in stillness. Imagine the boat lying quiet under a prowling destroyer, every man nailed into silence, the air thick with anticipation. The first charge cracked through the water, a sound too large to contain, hammering metal and ribs alike. Stumpf described it as a blow that seized even breath, the sort you felt inside your bones before your ears could catch it. First-hand testimonies and later experiments confirm it. Underwater explosions struck like hammer blows against the hull. compressing water into force that no one could resist or predict. Each pause that followed was worse than the blast itself. Men counted seconds in their heads, hoping to stretch them into safety. Too short, and dread swelled again. Too long, and nerves clawed with anticipation, straining for the next shudder. Stumpf admitted he sometimes held his breath the entire span, lungs aching, then gasping for air once steel held firm. The silence of the crew was absolute, hands locked tightly onto pipes, men staring at one another across bunks without a word. Whispering, even breathing too loud, seemed to risk provocative fate. Within that pause, ritual replaced action. A thumb rubbed smooth on a hidden coin, a seam pinched along a jacket sleeve, eyes closed against the light. In such times, survival narrowed to gestures meaningless on the surface, yet precious below. The boat recorded each detonation physically. Lamps swayed with vibrations, their light splintering into thin lines on riveted walls. Fine dust loosened from seams sprinkled down, flaring in lamplight as though the air itself frayed. Water trickled where condensation shifted, drops plinking into the bilge until their rhythm seemed amplified. The familiar odours of cramped life, stale wool, oil, sweat, now mingled with the overwhelming sharpness of fear, a scent none could forget. Stumpf wrote that every sense became exaggerated. Sounds cut harsher, light seemed thinner, movement heavier. The boat became not an object, but an instrument echoing every threat against it. You can almost hear the scene he sketched. The heavy boom outside, then the pressure of water slamming into steel. Pipes knocked loose in their sleeves, tools vibrated in racks. A thud might pass unnoticed in daylight, but during attack, each sound twisted into portent. One man clenched a pipe so hard that blood pooled in his palm from fingernails digging the skin, though he didn't notice until later. Another mouthed fragments of a prayer, lips moving silently so no vibration escaped into the air. Stumpf stopped detailing his own feelings, his entries breaking into shorter and sharper sentences, the words themselves bent by rhythm of blast, silence, blast. Historians have long noted that these attacks carried deeper psychological strain than even open artillery. Artillery could be answered, depth charges could not. A submarine had no counter to an enemy guessing above. There was no shield but patience. This helplessness drove men inward. Counting became a lifeline, a pattern to catch on to. Repetition of touch, whisper of verse, even the clenching of jaws gave rhythm where chaos ruled. Stumpf's account mirrors those archived elsewhere. Men converted terror into private rituals because action was denied them. When the attack finally ebbed, exhaustion replaced noise. Lamps steadied again. Dust settled onto damp sleeves and pooled in corners where drips gathered. Still, no one moved quickly. Men remained still, listening for a charge that did not come. Muscles shook, lungs pulled shallow at first, and only gradually came the recognition. They had survived. Relief carried no celebration. Instead came fragile laughter, or the collapse of men into bunks. Some voices cracked, chuckles breaking short, as if the body could not sustain both fear and relief together. Stumpf admitted to whispering a thanks, left unnamed, given to no one, but wrote it quietly, as if any loud acknowledgement might invite the destroyer back. Aftershocks lingered in the body. Men noticed their hands trembling as they reached for cups, some spilling coffee that steamed faintly in the heavy air. Others found sleep descending suddenly, ragged and deep, nerves snapped so completely by stress that weariness claimed them. The smell of fear seemed more pungent afterward, as if it had seeped from their skin into the walls themselves. Stumpf, more candid here than elsewhere, called himself an empty vessel, a phrase he underlined twice, noting that survival had stripped rather than honoured him. The victory was not triumph, but depletion, a hollowing proof that they simply endured. Those words reveal the change in him across the notebook. In early entries, he noticed the sea like an eager apprentice, sketching gulls and horizon lines. Here, his tone carries weight, sharpened by the near collapse of steel over his head. He no longer framed service in the colour of adventure. He understood survival itself as the only prize, earned at cost of nerves and spirit. Where once he longed for movement and novelty, his writing now hung on fatigue, gratitude edged with disbelief. He realised each patrol carried the same risk, and each reprieve left scars invisible but persistent. Pause and picture this final note. A man sitting rigid in the dim mess, face dusted white from falling powder, fingers blackened with oil, chest rising unevenly. Around him silence hangs, broken only by the faint creak of a boat settling in calmer water. Above waits an enemy unseen. Inside, the crew listens to their breath. Their victory, nothing more tangible than continued presence. Stumpf's diary preserves it in blunt words. No glory, no cheerful release, only fatigue and disbelief that steel had not yet given way. In the margin of history, these entries mark more than personal fear. They capture the endurance of men pushed past choice. Survival was not earned by weapon or action, but by silence that held steady under strain. Where propaganda celebrated victories, his diary recorded only the trembling aftermath. The way men lived through depth charges with bodies taut and voices still. The transformation is clear, an eager recruit written into a survivor, his own hand showing the change. From that survival came a new clarity. Stumpf began to write not only of external threats, but of the pressure building within the fleet itself. Fear could be endured for a night, but bitterness and inequality returned with every morning. In his later pages, the concern shifts. Complaints that once hid in whispers began to sharpen into questions of obedience. What held together under depth charges would soon strain against divisions no steel could contain. The unrest that shook steel from outside now grew louder within the fleet itself. This was not sudden or theatrical. It emerged slowly from daily grievances, set down in Richard Stumpf's diary with the weight of repetition. By 1917, scattered murmurs across warships had begun to sharpen into visible dissent, and Stumpf's entries captured that mood one page at a time. Where his early words spoke of routine and endurance, late war notes shifted into clipped observations about anger too long suppressed. He described how whispers passed between bunks with the same persistence as engine hum. Men speaking not of victory, but of exhaustion, of fairness withheld, of orders obeyed without reward. These were not speeches designed to gather momentum, but muttered fragments, grumbles over thin coffee, quiet refusal to laugh at officers' jokes, that nonetheless spread like damp along iron. Returning to port amplified the discontent. Ashore, the situation was collapsing faster than any repair crew could patch over. Bread grew scarce, ration lines wound through streets, and children waited hours for crusts. Stumpf described stepping out from the dark hull onto a pier that smelled of bilge and oil. only to be met by civilians whose faces carried famine. In their eyes, sailors were no longer protectors. They were seen as contributors to a war that emptied cupboards. Stumpf noted mutters among the crowds, words sharp enough to leave a uniformed man feeling less like a defender of the nation than a source of resentment. He captured how strange it felt to wear naval insignia, yet share the same hunger as those ashore, only with more suspicion aimed at him. The gulf between the official rhetoric of sacrifice and the lived reality of deprivation deepened his sense of futility. When he returned to his ship, the imbalance was already waiting inside steel walls. Boots polished, brass scrubbed, rations measured unequally. These once irritating details grew unbearable. The diary marks a scene in which one sailor tossed his rag into a corner and flatly refused to polish brass after hours. Nothing followed immediately, but Stumpf circled the moment, adding in the margin that it mattered. Such tiny refusals hinted at discipline fraying strand by strand, long before mutiny carried its name. Officers still received parcels from home or enjoyed thicker slices of bread, while enlisted men swallowed fatigue in silence. Even the act of hearing laughter muffled through partitions carried another kind of weight. He began to hear more meaning in the absence of laughter among his bunkmates than in the sound of commands above. By 1918, the diary's tone darkened further. Stumpf no longer wrote about the sea with any wonder. Instead, he reduced his service to the bare fact of enduring. Another order, another march, words stripped of suspense or pride. That summer, rumours spread among crews about a final operation, a push to sea that would send worn-out vessels into hopeless combat. Stumpf did not style himself a radical, but his pen admitted a reluctant sympathy with those planning to refuse. Survival, not orders, had become the measure of reason. That was his turning point, a reluctant sailor aligning himself with resistance, choosing endurance of life over endurance of duty. Meanwhile, censored letters from home grew thinner each month, reinforcing the despair. His wife's words arrived clipped, short phrases survive in review, yet clearly hinting at hunger and hardship. The gaps spoke louder than what inked lines revealed. Stumpf pieced together that his family's meals had shrunk, cupboards standing bare even as naval orders demanded obedience at sea. He wondered in one margin whether this sacrifice still had purpose if households starved while ships sailed endlessly. "What do we return to?" he wrote, in a clipped line that reappeared scattered across his later notebooks. That question felt heavier than any command. The breaking point came in autumn 1918, the Kiel Mutiny. Stumpf's account was subdued, but firmly anchored in the reality he later testified about before the Reichstag inquiry. He described not fiery slogans, but groups of sailors quietly refusing to board ships for missions seen as suicidal. Men stood in ranks, yet did not climb gangways. Orders echoed, but fell flat. He did not embellish. His entries remained clipped and brief, showing that the power lay in stillness itself. In that refusal, survival became the form of rebellion. For Stumpf, disobedience seemed less about ideology than about rejecting another round of futile sacrifice. Harbours. Across the fleet echoed that refusal. Picture the quays, officers barking commands, sailors planted solidly on decks, arms crossed, boots unmoving. The rebellion possessed no banners, no cheering crowd. It resonated in the refusal to move, in the silence where obedience used to be automatic. Stumpf wrote with restraint, but each short line held weight. Men had decided not to climb aboard, and that in itself was enough. The silence was rebellion, powered not by speeches, but by bodies refusing to yield. Historians later identified these events as the beginning of the empire's collapse and the catalyst for Germany's revolution. In Stumpf's diary, politics fade to the background. What surfaces instead are plain descriptions, sailors sharing bread, quietly stating they would not sail, nodding to one another in subdued agreement. He presented mutiny not as a dramatic uprising, but as resignation finally finding expression. When surrender came soon after, his relief was unmistakable but muted. At last, he wrote, the words carrying more weariness than triumph. They sounded like air finally released from lungs held too long, not like celebration. Even his handwriting mirrored that change. Pages that once crowded every line with tight script began to stretch. Words spaced themselves wider, less pressed by urgency, as though even his style of writing exhaled. The tone is striking not for fire but for exhaustion, a man grateful to be free of orders. For Stumpf, surrender did not arrive as defeat, but as the ceasing of endless strain. Diaries like his remind us that revolutions are not always born of ambition. Sometimes they rise from the ordinary persistence of grievances unaddressed, layered until refusal becomes survival itself. As his notes ended, Stumpf provided no sweeping conclusion. He left only the impression of a weary sailor recording how silence in the ranks ended a war at sea more effectively than shells. His diary testifies that grand events like the Kiel Mutiny can be traced back to countless quiet refusals. A rag tossed aside, a word muttered across a mess table, an order met with stillness. The scale of empire may have collapsed around him, but his words give evidence of the smaller collapse within each man's endurance. It is in that pared down voice, sharpened by years of service and stripped of illusion, that his final perspective emerges. He framed the end, not in victories or defeats, but in endurance finally reaching its limit. That moment, preserved in pencil strokes on thin paper, is his truest conclusion. And as his notebooks close, the question turns toward what a man writes when the war is finally past, when reflection arrives in the place of duty. What remains once the fighting stops is the voice of a man who survived. In Richard Stumpf's final pages, you no longer hear the eager recruit standing stiff in his new uniform, but the quieter reflection of someone who has endured fear, noise, confinement, and come through to a war's exhausted end. His entries soften noticeably, sentences shorten, pauses stretch, even his handwriting loosens, as though survival itself slowed the urgency of his pencil. He admits plainly that survival, not victory, became the only prize. Ship sunk and orders carried out no longer seemed to matter. Lives spared did. He writes without ornament, only the recognition that endurance had replaced achievement. Where medals and commands filled newspapers, his diary included nothing of the sort. Instead, there are pages that read like ledgers of air inhaled, rations eaten, mornings seen. For him, this was enough. 3 strands emerge from his final reflections. The first is guilt. He cannot separate himself from the memory of carrying out orders whose effects he fully understood. He does not excuse or defend. Each torpedo fired remained part of him, each blast a shadow against the relief of his own survival. That guilt was quiet but permanent, stitched into the margins as pauses more than arguments. Second is gratitude. He is thankful not for victories, but for small freedoms rediscovered. He speaks of breathing without diesel fumes, of tasting bread not tainted by damp air, of sunlight on skin without the weight of steel closing around it. These are not grand blessings, but daily mercies. His diary closes in this key. To walk out and feel wind against his face was proof of life more powerful than propaganda's triumphs. The third is acceptance. He settles on the truth that war left no true victors. He survived, and that was both everything and very little. He does not argue for meaning inside defeat or claim resolution through duty fulfilled. He acknowledges only what remains, living through exhaustion, scarred by memory, carrying the strain quietly but permanently. The tone is not despairing, it is steady, the voice of a man who no longer expects clarity from conflict, but will continue to carry its echoes. Imagine him writing now at a wooden table by a window, no officers standing behind him, no hull trembling beneath. Birds pass outside, air moves freely. His pencil touches paper with more space between each thought, as though he finally had room enough to let his mind wander. You notice the difference not in what he describes, but in what he allows to fall silent. No more long lists of orders or notes of routine. Only an acknowledgement that to breathe, to continue, was the measure left. Later history would preserve his words. Stumpf's notebooks were submitted to the Reichstag inquiry after the war, used to testify about the officer caste's treatment of enlisted sailors. In 1927, excerpts appeared in print, and in 1967 a full English edition brought his diary to wider readers. Those pages, once folded and hidden inside a sailor's space, came to hold national and historical weight. What makes their survival powerful is not that they tell of his strategies or victories, but that they preserve how one man saw his life narrowed and reshaped by service. This preservation matters because in his restraint lies truth. Whereas official histories counted tonnage sunk or ships lost, his voice captured quieter costs. The erosion of nerves, the burden of waiting, the strain of duties that mark some men as less than others. His reflection stands as a reminder that survival itself transforms a person every bit as much as combat does. These last notes are not triumphant, but they are enduring. They carry the ordinary honesty of someone who survived, and through that survival became witness. You can hear it if you picture his page, a statement written slowly, breathing steady, shaped more by pauses than descriptions. No declaration of victory, no claim of heroism, only the soft wisdom that war left men changed into survivors, and that this in itself was both the prize and the cost. His diary closes not in flourish, but in simple truth. Surviving mattered, even when survival was shadowed by loss and guilt. That is what he chose to pass forward. In the margins of his closing words, readers today still find what history books cannot, a plain account of what it meant to endure. His reflections invite us not to celebrate, but to recognize survival as its own testimony. They show how even the smallest details, a lungful of clean air, a sentence saved in a notebook, can outlast campaigns and maps. That quiet insistence carries an authority greater than rhetoric. It tells us what the war felt like to the people who lived it. This voice, restrained yet clear, guides us toward the story's end. It directs attention away from politics and strategy, back to the humanity that managed to persist, and it leaves us listening, attentive to how fragile pages carried the burden of memory when steel and empire fractured. From here, the story no longer belongs to warships or commanders, but to the ink that survived them. In the end, the question is what remains when war, discipline, and fear have receded. The conclusion sits quietly inside Richard Stumpf's notebooks, records of the high seas fleet that endured the war and were later preserved, published in 1927 and translated fully in 1967. His pages tell us that survival was rarely about triumph. It was about finding words when silence pressed from all sides. Each entry stands as proof that even in confinement, men searched for meaning, in guilt remembered, in gratitude for air, in the resilience to keep writing. His diary captures those truths without flourish, just persistence. So as we close, reflect on this. History books may record victories, but diaries preserve the fragile voice that refused to disappear. Picture one page left open, ink still dark, a breath drawn freely above the water. If a moment from his diary stayed with you, share it in the comments. And if you want to hear more voices like his, remember to subscribe.